So with this way of expanding, this is an invitation for all of you to have a broader scope about this. The decision of having this seminar has to do with an effort to conduct more webinars in situations of other countries in the region, because the situation in Latin America is a great concern. We are the region in the world that the international protection of human rights has a treaty of violence against women. And I think this is an important reminder that this topic should be a priority in the political and social agenda of our countries. From Alianza Americas, we are working with the aspiration of creating the conditions for migration to be an option and not the only alternative to survive. And that construction of societies where violence is not the option of survival should include violence against women. To start with Mexico, Mexico is the neighbor country of the US. Mexico is a huge country and very important country, but we also wanted to retake this agenda of advocacy work because we think that the pandemic started to alter with the agendas, but I don't know if you remember the clamor of May 8th in Mexico City. Those protests in Mexico City and in other Mexican countries, which reflected a particular scenario and the rejection to specific crimes. And we saw a lot of frustration with the state response and the demand for responses from the state. And it's important to mention that if there was an expectation of what could come to Mexico afterwards, but the pandemic came along and all of this work disappeared. So we think that it's important, even now, even under the conditions of confinement that have meant greater situations of insecurity, and that there are many women who are going through confinement, and being in that situation puts them at more risk. We do have agendas of public health. We are concerned about economic reactivation, but we have to insist, and we have to start from now on to insist that the federation, the states, and the municipal authorities, as well as society, would respond adequately to violence against women. That is why we wanted to keep this view on the prevention, protection, and justice. We believe that these are three important axes that should be in public policies and in the agenda as well. It is important to highlight that all of the reports of human rights, of the procedures from United Nations, highlight the topic of violence against women. And they always give recommendations that are useful. And I think that that challenge lies in transcending those recommendations and start making progress through public policies. And that's what we want with this discussion. We have a great panel. We have three speakers. I've seen Estefanía appears and disappears. I don't know if she's having connection problems. Are you there, Estefanía? No, everything's great. So we have three speakers. Estefanía Vela Varga, she's a researcher, a teacher, and an activist, executive director of Intersect. Fabiola Mondragón, legal project director, and Isabel Erreguerena, coordinator of public policies from EQUIS, Justice for Women. So we thank all three of them for being here. Welcome. The conversation today is divided into 4 parts to guide the discussion, but I want to clear out for the audience. We're going to discuss the context of violence. We're going to talk about militarization in Mexico and its impact in the increase of violence. We're going to discuss the institutional response in terms of the Centers of Justice for Women. And at last, we are going to talk about access to justice. What I want to ask all of you and remind you to please add your questions in the Q&A section. In the chat for the people who are listening the interpretation in English, those 2 questions are going to be included in the final version. We thank everyone who has joined in. We thank you for being here with us today. Stefania, I would like to start with you. I had the opportunity to listen to a presentation you made about the research from Intersecta, the keys to prevent and understand crimes against women in Mexico. And the research is very important. It is very interesting as well. So I want to ask you to please help us understand a little bit more about the context in Mexico. And I'm going to start with the first question. How have murders against women changed in the country? Thank you very much. I have a kitten that comes in and out and turns off my camera, but it is a pleasure for me to be here with you, with Fabi, with Isabel. You are women that I admire. I am a fan. And I know that we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to try to get into the topic as fast as possible. Research, for whoever is interested, is called Keys to Prevent and Understand Murders Against Women. It was created by Data Civica and CIDE, where when I was still working in that area. In Intersecta, we have followed and traced the clues that are on those report that are in that report to understand what is happening in the way women are murdered in Mexico. This report is a statistical report. It is an analysis of the murders of men and women from 2000 to 2007. We have updated it to 2018, and we have seen the general patterns and what they tell us about where we should focus our efforts. Once again, data only tells one part of the story. We still have to see case by case, but at least this data give us clues on how these patterns have changed. First, some basic data, and I'm going to connect this to what you said with May 8th. For years, feminists in Mexico have pointed out how violence against women has scaled up. A statistic that is tragic that persists is that in average, 10 women are killed in Mexico a day. And the last statistics, or the last 3 years, every year breaks the record of the previous year. 2017 was the higher rate of murders. Then 2018 came, it broke that record. 2019 broke that record from 2018 as well. So what we are seeing right now in Mexico and what we are discussing is what is going on with the pandemic. The murders of women went 337 women, 11 women a day. So we have a great problem. Women are being killed in Mexico, and it's important to say also that Mexico has the highest rate of murders against women. Why? Or how do we understand this violence? The first thing that I think it's important to highlight is that if we analyze the data, there are differences in how women are killed in Mexico, and there are similarities as well. One of the similarities is that murders against women started to grow at the same rate that men. We have a difference in 2007. Homicides from women and men were decreasing. There were sprouts in specific municipalities or entities, like in Juarez, because it had a meaningful increase mid-90s, but then they started to decrease. So as of 2007, we see a spike in violence. So that is the first key that I am interested in pointing out. One of the basic things that we have done through feminism is to analyze phenomena with the gender perspective, is to state a question. How does violence against women impact and women and impact men? This is a key question. However, what we have seen is that in Mexico, we have emphasized on differences. So a narrative has been built upon this. If they, even though they kill less women in comparison to men, are killed in different places and in different ways. 1 in every 3 women are murdered at home, but in men is 1 in 10, which is what you were saying at the beginning. This association between the murders of women and domestic violence, which happens at home. Another thing that is pointed out oftentimes is that women are asphyxiated, are killed forcefully or with items, which is the narrative about how brutally women are killed. And we saw that in Juarez, where we found women with injuries or naked, which was not the case for men. This is true. This continues to happen. Homicides at home, and I know that Fabi and Isabel are going to address this too. But in spite of all the policies that have been implemented, the rate of homicides in households is still high. The proportion is still huge as well. But as of 2007, we see a change. First, murders of women started increasing in the public space. And in 2009, they overflow the ones in the household. And this not only in Mexico. If we see the analysis from UNODC, the Agency Against Drugs that informs of gender murders, it happens that women are killed more in the household, but this is not the case in Mexico. And now they are not at risk at home, but they are also at risk in the street. Number 2, we saw a spike in murders with firearms, both in the household and in the public or in the street. In 2018, the number of murders against women increased 100%. In men, 347%. Today, 6 of every 10 women are killed with a firearm. And what happens? There are other similarities that are important as well. And what we can see is that homicides of men increase in the street and also of women. If the murders of men increase with firearms, it also increases for women. We see this at a national level and at the state level. In states that murder against men spike, it also spikes for women because women don't live in a bubble. If the cities are in a crisis, it is also going to affect women. So what happens with this? This doesn't denies domestic violence. It makes us make more complex the analysis that we have to make, or what we should do to reduce the number of women who are murdered. Once we acknowledge these similarities in patterns, we find another barrier, which is that in the public speech, the narrative has been that generalized violence is due to criminal organized crime. One day, these criminal groups decided to explode this criminality and levels of violence. And this is important because it seems that we have 2 different narratives. Either murders of women are because of machismo or chauvinistic attitudes, or they are because of organized crime that decided to create more violence. And we have known now that it's part of chauvinistic attitudes, but also criminal crime. And that is why 2007 comes into play, very importantly, because militarization comes into play. The government decided to face criminal organized crime, starting to release because more military, because they were always in the street. And we have heard it from the indigenous communities, women which had militarized context. But what happens in 2007 is that the amount of soldiers starts to multiply like never before, and they come from 5,000 soldiers to 50,000 soldiers deployed along all of the national territory. And what we can see, and this is something from the investigation, is that in the deployment of military, the clashes between the military groups and the allegedly criminal organizations, because once you analyze these problems, they don't surge because of the criminal organizations, or they don't surge because of deep investigation, and they lead to a capture. There isn't a lot of investigation. What happens is that there are more patrol and people that seem suspicious, and from there on it ends up in a shooting. So whoever is interested, you should read La Tropa, which is one of the books, and it starts with a description of soldiers that are in a convoy. They see an old car with tinted windows just turning around Saturday nights, and they decide to stop them. They don't stop, and it ended up in a shooting. And it was just a family leaving a party. And I think this is important to see, because it also helps us demystify this perception of how militaries work. And once we see it in practice, it is not like that, because as of this clashes, we see that wherever a clash is, violence or homicides start increasing. With Laura Tuesta, what we have seen is how these clashes impact women and men in order to prove if those clashes influence the increase of murders in women. And for every additional clash, the murders of women increase 4% in a municipality. So this is important, not to deny all the other hypotheses, but to say how complex violence is, and that we shouldn't stay only with chauvinistic attitudes or femicides or criminal activity. So because criminal activity has always been there, and there is a complexity of violence, and we have to see a specific context, and that is why feminists have been fighting for so long. The differences and the context matter a lot. So that's what has made more complex violence against women. If we want to reduce it, we cannot only focus in the household. We also have to go to the street. If we want to reduce it, we cannot only focus on organized crime, but also on the strategies that the state has deployed to fight this, like militarization, because it's relevant. 2 weeks ago, our president issued an agreement to go in depth without any control, this militarization from here to 2024. And what we have seen that is, instead of stopping this strategy, we still bet towards it. Estefania, if we would like to think or consider everything you have said, the importance of context and these elements, what kinds of measures should we be taking into account to reduce the murder of women? So I'm gonna leave violence at home for Isabel and the other colleague, but there are two issues that are clear in terms of murders in the public space. One, the demilitarization. While our bet is towards the military, and this is important because oftentimes we are told that it's militaries, but it also includes civil police. And what we see is that parallel construction of the building these institutions, it's not happening. It's not only about taking the militaries out of the street, but also invest in the authorities locally, because everyone who works in security here is not the same thing between states. There are differences between states, and it sounds easy, but that's the struggle that we are going through. This is a topic that, or a survey came out 2 weeks ago. 80% of people support militarization. So it sounds easy to say demilitarize, but how do you face the population that trusts militaries? Something else that seems crucial to me is weapon control. 6 of every 10 women are killed with a firearm, and that also leads to militaries. There is an investigation from the Commission of human rights and how it has increased the purchase of weapons, and that creates a cascade of violence. On the other hand, aside from the same authorities coming together, in vitro shows that people are getting more and more weapons, even though you are not involved in any kind of criminal network. And research in the US have shown how the single presence of a firearm in a household would increase the risk for women more than men of dying murdered. So one of the crucial topics is weapon control for people that are not necessarily involved in security or criminal networks. It seems easy, but we know that this is a very complicated agenda that does not only involve Mexico, but also the US and other countries that make us speak about barriers or front borders, sorry, and some other things. So those would be two key topics for me. So I also wanted to ask you about the impact of militarization in the murder of women, in the registry, sorry. And there are many people who think that the key is to talk about femicides, which is a term that I know you don't use. And I would like to ask you if you could briefly tell us about the records or the registry of murders against women, and also the use of that term feminicide. When I talk about murders, because we don't know how many feminicides are in Mexico, and based on the premise that all the lives of women matter, one of the things that we are fighting for is to improve that registry to be able to know how many feminicides are there, because many of the feminist hypotheses that we have seen reflected are important. We want to know if there's torture or if there is a context of family violence, how the bodies of people have been exposed, if there was a previous report made or not. Right now, we don't have that information. So if we want to reduce the women who are murdered, we have to see the entire phenomenon, and we have to try to distinguish what is happening. There could be feminicides in a militarization context, or in criminal organization or domestic violence. We have to fight for all of them, and we want to fight for that registry to happen in a good way. COVID-19 has taught us that our state has the capacity to publish every day data of deaths. Every day. They are showing that if they want to, they can do a fine analysis of the deaths. If we wanted to know what is happening right now with the murders of women, if they're being at household or in the street, we have to wait until 2021 where the data come along. So there's a complete topic of insisting that all of the strength that we have seen with COVID, we need something similar to happen of transparency in data to be able to see what's happening with all of the citizens. Thank you very much, Estefanía. Any of these topics is interesting, and it is hard to condense in time. So I thank you, and now I'm gonna go with Isabel. We have several topics to talk about with Isabel, and I wanna go back to militarization also, that Estefanía was talking about, because I think it is key. And I think it's important to talk some elements about the context from what Estefanía was saying. It is important to remind the non-Mexican citizen that as of the fight against narcotraffic, this violence is spiked, and it is impacted by the creation of the National Guard. This is like a hybrid force between the military and the police. So how is this context affecting women? First of all, I wanted to thank you for the invite. I feel fortunate to be in this space with women that I admire so much. I think that this question we'll continue with the answers from Estefanía. From EQUIS, we have seen 4 specific phenomenon where militarization has affected women. The first one is something that Estefanía talked about in a very clear way, and is the increase in the murder of women. Since 2016, we see a spike. In 2006, we see this and this change in patterns that happen at the public space with firearms, and the homicides that happen in public space are the same as men in the municipalities. The second phenomenon that we identify is what Estefanía was mentioning as well, and is the change in the patterns of violence. Previously, most women were killed in the household, but now it's in the public space. One element that from EQUIS we have worked is the incarceration of women. Because of the war against drugs, we have documented, according to the different census, that nowadays the main reason for which women are deprived of liberty is because of crimes against health. But in the common forum, we have seen that in 2 years, 103% of women have increased the going to prison because of these crimes. And we can also see that men are only half of this data or of this figure. So the question here is why? And we look at the figures and the life stories of the women who have been stopped or who have been detained because of drug activity. Most of them are because they are in possession for commercial purposes. So they are the women who put drugs in themselves to transpass it to other places. Many of these women have been detained in the southern border that come from Colombia and want to cross to the US, and they have specific profile. These are women that had never committed a crime in the past and who didn't commit a crime with violence, who are the prime caregiver of minors, and that usually have only a basic education. So we can see that when we think about war against militarization and drug activity, we are looking at this drug lords like El Chapo, but whoever gets more incarcerated because of this is women. And this is relevant because even though the current president established in a campaign that the war against drugs was a failed activity, and they established in the plan that they will make more regular the market of drugs, we can see nowadays, today, we woke up with the news that the National Guard just insured 108 kilos of marijuana. And we still see that there is a lot of detention, especially of drug consumers. Therefore, this incarceration is going to continue, and this is very concerning for us. The other element about militarization that I would like to talk about is the violation of human rights, specifically torture to women. We can see, according to the survey for detentions, the women who were detained by the army were sexually tortured in 21%, while in men, it's only 5%. So aside from looking at the figures, we can see the life stories in reports like from Amnesty International or of Surviving Death, or the Center for Human Rights, which is called Breaking the Silence, where we can see these stories. I had the opportunity to interview 15 women who were detained for crimes against health. and all of them had been sexually tortured. So these are the main phenomenon of militarization in women, and it is a great concern because, as Estefania was saying, we see the agreement that was issued 2 weeks ago, and there is another element that is of a lot of concern for us. The National Guard is being sold as the solution to feminicides. As Fabi is going to present clearly, we not only have a problem in how justice is served, but putting the National Guard on the streets places us at risk. It's not protecting us, it's not preventing feminicides, it is increasing the risk of being arbitrarily detained, of being tortured, and having our rights violated. Thank you, Isabel. And now, unfortunately, we cannot stay just here, but let's talk about the institutional response of violence against women. And specifically, I would like to speak to you about the Centers for Women's Justice. It's a classical formula that was sold and was scattered like water in around the world, but specifically in Latin America from different modalities. But the Centers for Women's Justice is a physical space or facilities that has different offers at the local, state, and national level. The question I want to ask you, how is this response, is this institutional response responding to violence, and how could these services be improved? This Centers for Women's Justice is a great public policy, as you were talking about, that comes out after the sentence of the Cotton Plans. And when we see the figures, it is a public policy that seems logic. When we see the house dynamics and relations, we see that 78.6% of women who go through violence by their partners, they don't ask for support. And when we analyze, it's because they are afraid of retaliation, or they didn't know where to make the report. So this Center for Women's Justice allows us to analyze this response of fear to retaliation, because we have to know that justice has to go beyond access to the courts. It needs to have a multidimensional aspect. So if we ask ourselves, why do women don't go? Because they have to leave their children, taken care of by someone. And if they go to make a report and they come back home, they're going to be brutally violated. Or if they go to institution, they're not going to have any economic support afterwards. And since this has a legal space, psychological support, economics support through different trainings, and that would seem to be the answer, to have these centers. But from EQUIS, when we made an analysis of how these Centers of Women's Justice were working, we noticed that they had serious issues with the institutional design and the legislative design. To start, there is no homologation between women's justice centers on how they were created and the government agency that they depend on. Most of them are created from an agreement of the DA. So that means that as they were built, they can disappear at any moment also. And aside, we also found the functions are not clearly stated, and most depend from the DA's office. So on one side, there is punitive access to justice, and on the other hand, the DA's or these centers coordinate several ministries, and the DA's office don't have that coordination work. We also noticed that most don't have a budget autonomy or their own legal incorporation. So how can we say if these centers are going to work well if they don't have any autonomy, and there is no process to assess and choose the director or the staff? And we have seen this with the Observatory of Justice. with the organizations of feminism that we work in 4 states of the Republic, most of them don't have enough staff to provide the work that they had to do 24/7. And I would like to think about the context of COVID-19. We saw a deficiency in how the SEHUMs, which is the centers, were working. And now we are looking at very concerning case. There is one case that we were just reported about, a justice center that only receives women who were raped on that day. If you were raped the previous day, you're not going to get attention. They are not going to receive you if you are not really hurt. If they hit you in the face because of the contingency, they're not going to receive you. And they're not receiving violence if there was an attempted feminicide. If you don't show how you were injured, they're not going to receive you. So we can see the deficiencies. And on the other hand, we are concerned about the centers because they are not thought for all of the women. Specifically, we have noticed that there is no accessible infrastructure for women with disabilities, or they don't have knowledge on the Mexican sign language for deaf women. They don't have any knowledge to treat women with an intellectual disability, and especially psychosocial, because sometimes we have information that they are gone through training, forceful training. And so what happens if you're gonna want to get support, and then you get in a psychiatric ward afterwards? When we made a request of information for the justice centers in the country, we noticed that only 5 accept users of drugs, but only tobacco and alcohol, and they have to be in recovery. So what happens if you're using and you're hit by your partner? That is a great concern. And we're also concerned about the topic that Estefanía talked about changing patterns, which are focused only in family violence. So we have a case, for instance, that a woman came. She was a foreign woman, and she had been raped. And since she was foreign, service couldn't be given to her. If we see these changes in patterns of violence, these centers should also expand their services for violence in the public space. Those would be our main comments for the justice centers. There is a proposal to include in the access of victim to, we are still discussing, and there are 2 for these to be decentralized. So we will have to discuss the topic about the senators. And this is also talking about migrants. We have very few migrants accepted. So if you are a migrant that is coming from a country that comes from, we still have to strengthen these policies because of these points. It is important to it has to do with the alternative measures to incarceration as part of the new justice systems. How are those alternative measures working in Mexico? I think that this is related to the first question. In EQUIS, we are some of the few organizations that follow up on violence of women, but also the victims, the ones that are being accused of criminal activity. And at the beginning, you were talking about the different violences that happen from state agencies. What we have seen is that women who are incarcerated in, I would like to describe the 4 moments of measures that could exist and the issues that we have found in the alternative measures Alternative measures to incarceration could happen at the beginning of the judicial process. When you're accused and the process starts, an alternative measure could be included. We have a serious problem in Mexico of the expansion of preventive incarceration. The preventive incarceration, to explain real quick, is that when you are accused of a criminal activity or a crime against health, or in case of kidnapping or several crimes, automatically, without having the public ministry of the or the judge see your situation, they would put you in preventive incarceration. And according to the studies from Estefanía Vela, in the preventive incarceration affects much more women than men. So that is also important. So as much as we can define some measures at the beginning, like the measure that is issued the most is the preventive incarceration. Sorry if I stopped the translation because of that. So certain characteristics were included, like signing, going to different classes, and you don't get to that incarceration point. Also, in the determination of the sentence, there are other alternatives, like working in favor of the community. And at last, when you are in prison, in the penal execution, there is the possibility, according to the national law of criminalization, is to shorten the time incarcerated and have pre-releases. In this regard, even though it seems a very attractive framework, when we analyze the alternative measures in Mexico, these are not applied. The first element we saw is that justice enforcers in the common forum solve in a systematized way. They don't see the women who is processed. Most of women who are incarcerated are the prime caregivers, either of minors or people with disabilities or elders or ill people. So they don't see, we have a close case of Gabi, who has a child with cerebral palsy. Residence incarceration would be the best, because she has to take care of her children. And we saw different judicial agencies that don't know the new penal system, and they continue applying the traditional penal system. So this, we have also analyzed that that subconsciously, and this could be a great problem, and a seminar could be given about this. In the subconscious of the judicial system is that not putting into jail is impunity. And this goes hand in hand with a whole campaign of punitive populism, where we think that incarceration is the only solution. So with the judges, consider that if they put an alternative measure, they are increasing impunity in Mexico. And also, judges don't know about the new national legislation of penal execution. Therefore, they always try, in most of the cases, they want to try how not to apply these pre-release measures. From EQUIS, we have had a lot of litigations, and we haven't been able to release anyone under this law. If we talk with Mexicans who are united against this, haven't been able to do it. So the people who litigate say that this law is not working. So we should also see other alternatives, like the amnesty law. So I don't want to take much more of your time, so thank you. Fabiola, I want to ask you to discuss the topic of access to justice, because I think this is a core topic. So the first element is for you to identify what are the mechanisms that women have available to them to ask for protection from the authorities in Mexico. First of all, thank you for inviting me, and it is the first time that I get to be with Isa and Estefanía in a panel, who are women that I admire a lot. The law to access includes the precautionary measures, preventive measures, but the most important one, from my point of view, is the protection orders, because a difference from the other mechanisms, these have advantages. They are emergency ones, and they don't require for a woman to request it directly. A relative or someone that knows that women can ask for it. For instance, right now with the pandemic, they are living with their aggressor. Maybe a neighbor could ask for this. And the authority is the one to go and establish a protection order for this woman. And this also helps the women to start a process or make a report. And that is why women look for help for different reasons. Maybe they don't want to report their aggressor because they have an affectionate relationship with them. It is their partner, or they depend economically from them or their family. And it could bring retaliation, and they wouldn't get protection from authorities. And also the fact that it is not attached to a judicial process limits all of the judicial process. They get re-victimized, or they ask for proof, or because of the inefficiency in the process, they end up with results that are not good for them, or without any protection. And also the protection orders are not conditioned for women to go a principle of good faith. In case women, they wouldn't have to credit a migratory status, and they don't have restrictions, geographic restrictions. If something happens to them in one state, they can go to another one. And that is why women in condition of migration don't want to go to the authorities, because they could get caught. And the protection measures are flexible depending on the level of risk of the victim and the needs that are detected in the questions made by the authorities. And there is no specific period for protection. For instance, an emergency protection for 72 hours could be in place, but in the precautionary measures or in the judicial measures, they could be extended if the risk persists. Thank you, Fabiola. And in the current context, what has been the experience in using these mechanisms? What you mentioned is very attractive, to request this online or for a third party to request it on behalf of the victim. Have you seen an increase of violence against women and girls? I think that access to this mechanism hasn't been easy for women due to different reasons. First, just as what it happens with the justice centers, there is no homogeneity in how they are going to be implemented. There's a general law that regulates it, but every state has its local law, and they have different criteria, both of who can request it, which authorities can dictate them. For instance, non-considered community authorities to prevent access to justice of indigenous women, for example, or how long they last. Some are 72 hours, but in Nuevo León it's 30. So what are the criteria to dictate all of these measures? There is no specific tool for the risk analysis of the victims and to know what are the appropriate measures to implement. And this is not regulated either, for there to be coordination activities with the shelters to channel these victims and to create a follow-up plan and an assessment to see what is the status once the protection order is issued. So there are a lot of discrepancies. And what happens is that the authorities, even knowing the law, they are not certain of which points or faculties they can use, and they are afraid of infringing or the rights of the aggressor by issuing this order, or by going against the judge or the public ministry, and vice versa. They also don't have a perspective of disability or cultural, which doesn't protect women who come from an ethnic group or of migrants or disabled women. And even though these laws exist, they are not socialized among the different authorities to execute them. Maybe they have their own protocols, but what happens is that the authorities don't know what are their obligation to protect and fight against violence against women. And what we found in the research that we made with authorities from Nuevo León is that when they were issuing a protection order, they thought they were going against the rights of the aggressor. And the ones who issued it, they wanted to damage the aggressor. So if they have their partner, they just wanted to take revenge or something like that. So the protection order is not given to them because of that. And also they don't think that there is a risk just because they have a bruise. It doesn't mean that their life is at risk. So since victims are not showing that their life is at risk, then a protection order is not issued. They think that if the woman is not ready to make a report against the aggressor, that they shouldn't be protected. Or if they had gone before to ask for the protection order and one was given to them, but then by other reasons they decided to go back with the aggressor, they can't request it again because it's like wasting public resources. And all of these kinds of stereotypes shows the lack of training in the staff to work with gender-based violence. And what happens is that they go back to their households without any kind of protection or with any kind of follow-up to see if the conditions of violence persist. And if they are able to get a protection order, the authorities do not comply with their obligations of tracking this, or of doing patrolling, or of making calls. They say that they don't have enough staff. So they are the ones, they say that they tell the victims that they should go and tell their aggressors that there's a protection order in place, because they say that there isn't any resource even for the shelters for victims to go there. So there isn't a robust system to guarantee the safety of women. And the clear example of this is, even though there has been an increase in the demand of services from these shelters, there is a cut in the budget that they have to operate. And it has to do specifically with this, with making this gender-based violence invisible. So the deficiencies mean an increase in violence when the protection orders should prevent from increasing. And many times these end up in feminicides. I think it's sad and very concerning, all of the scenario that you're showing us. And you pointed out different obstacles for these mechanisms to be effective. Are there any other obstacles that you mentioned that you didn't mention? And are there any solutions to overcome those obstacles that you can tell us about? Unfortunately, the issues in implementation are one, but also there is another problem that has to do with the right of access to information, which translates in the lack of access to justice for women. First, we have that women do not know, they ignore that there are judicial powers in place and what are the functions or the obligations that they have to protect them. They don't know that the protection orders exist or who is able to request it, to see what kind of response it can get to the authorities. in case the protection order is not complied with, or if the term is over and the risk persists, they don't know that they can ask for an extension. And this is due to the fact that the authorities are not complying with access to information and to disseminate all of the services that they provide. And we also analyzed this in the report that we made about justice enforcers, to see what was the first response of judicial enforcers when COVID came into place. They didn't take the appropriate measures, and even the judicial powers that were there to issue emergency orders were only disseminated through releases in their own web pages that couldn't be found, or in the best of cases in social media. But what happens is that in Mexico, 6 out of 10 people don't have internet connection. And in case of women who are living with their aggressor, they cannot go into the judicial power to see that press release. And if you don't have that knowledge about the legal jargon, you're not going to understand what these services are or the measures that are being taken, that are being put into place to protect you. So I think that judicial power and all of the authorities in charge of protecting women and providing them with services have not complied with all of this, and are providing information and to the citizenship to see what are the obligations of the authorities and how to request this protection. And we also found that the lack of information also works in another sense. It's not only that it's not disseminated to the citizenship, but there is an uncompliance from the state to create this information or statistic information about the protection orders and how they work. Theoretically, Labine should be reporting all of these protection orders, but when you go into their page, there is only a number of protection orders, and it is not accessible either. Like making a user and see all of that information. If there was a relationship between the aggressor and the victim, how long they lasted, if they were tracked. So since you don't have this information, you cannot make an analysis of the public policy to see how they are failing and how to improve their implementation. And I think this is also reflected in a lack of interest from the state to see the dimension of gender-based violence in the country. And consequently, all the measures that should be taken proportionally to tend to it. And the declarations from the president in the last few weeks about the falsehood of this calls, when nationwide there has been an increase in violence, and the resources from the state have been reduced also to tend to this problem. So Fabiola, thank you. We have ended the first part of the expose, and now we're going to go to the Q&A, who Soraya is going to moderate. Go ahead, Soraya. Elena, thank you very much. Thank you, Estefanía. Thank you, Isabel and Fabiola. All the information you just shared with us is very important. And I separated the questions in segments, which have come to us. And it's very important to know in more detail. For Estefanía, aside from violence in the street, is there data that show the rate of violence at the workplace, including public spaces? So that was the first one. Alejandra Alguero asks, a question as part of militarization in Mexico and the deaths of women, have you seen forced disappearing of women in line with drug fighting, not in looking for them, but in the disappearance of women, and what have you found? Another question is, what does that increase of deaths in spaces mean? And the last one, you said that a high percentage of population support militarization. What happens with women? Do women also support militarization, or what is the response from women? So maybe you can respond, and then I go with Isabel and Fabiola. I think it's important. I provided the link to the report, which shows all of the data that are missing. As you could see, usually I only talk about men and women. And the analysis, institutional analysis, was perfect because it was necessary. With the figures that we have from homicides, it cannot be done. There are crucial variables that are not recorded. For instance, if the victims of murders have a disability, it's not recorded. If they are from the LGBT population, they are not recorded. If they come from an ethnic group, they are not recorded. And a problem that we see is that when there's a variable there and the obligation from the authorities to collect the information, this is not done. For instance, in 2012, the variable of the language of the victim was incorporated. In 2018, 25% of cases, this information is not included. So that fine-tuned analysis only with murders is not complied with. And that is one of the fundamental things. There's a lot of violence, and this is also linked to disappearances. Our capacity to know these violences and how this impact different women and men is very limited. For the ones who are interested in the impact of violence against migrants, that's why we need to do this field research from people from the academia, and women and men is so important. Overall, this is essential to make a fine-tuned analysis of the differentiated murders from the different population, because in Mexico we are a machista community, racist community, but both men and women are overrepresented in homicides. And I think that is a key to see who violence is impacting. The INEGI has some variables on murders at the workplace, and I responded that in private. Most happen on the street or on the roads, not in the workplace. But about the disappearances and intersecta, we haven't followed up on this topic yet. And I go back to the topic of militarization. Militarization has had multiple impacts. We started with murders because that had led us to the investigation, but we know that Data Cívica in the Mexican Commission for the Defense or Promotion of Human Rights, or the Alvarado case, is crucial. Other colleagues are also working on human trafficking. And my main point would be, we have to see militarization. We have to go in depth in the effects of militarization. We don't have a small problem. We have noticed the lack of information, because we don't even know how, when, or where militaries have been. There is an investigation of Laura Tosta that goes against all of the information that we have received from other sources. So this is a topic for all of our organizations to come together and do their part to be able to understand the multiple issues. That's as far as I know for disappearances, which is part of the problem and what we have been able to see and documented for other organizations. As many alliances as we can make would be better to see this phenomenon. Also, the question about the approval of women towards militaries, the survey is not breaking down by sex, but it says that both men and women have a good image of militaries in the street, or of the Marines and the soldiers. And I think there are gender differences, but very slightly. And what I think is essential is with the nuances. If we have had 13 years of military deployment, why are they still popular? One of the hypotheses that I have, and this also comes in an investigation from CIDE, is that what has been reported from the atrocities of militaries in comparison to the atrocities of criminal organizations is less in period. So the information that we have on militaries, on Marines and soldiers is very scarce in comparison. And that is something that we have to do. From the little evidence that we have to insist on it to be increased, to start this public discussion and this good face that militaries are being given in all indicators. The violence that militaries exercise is brutal in comparison to other police authorities. There was a research, and this is my last point. I published it with Impol, the people who were deprived of liberty, and it shows of these people deprived of liberty, who arrested them. It was the municipal police, federal police, state police, or militaries, and how there is a variable in torture and in the way they were arrested. In all the indicators in SEMAR, or the militaries, are the worst ranking. They don't arrest with detention orders, especially for women. It's much more common for them just to be taken from the place where they were. They are the ones who kick the most, who rape the most, and the ones that delay the process to take you to the MT. The detention lasts over 24 hours, and it's a lot in comparison to the other police forces or justice enforcers. We know that the police is not perfect either, but within the mistakes, at least in terms of violence, there are brutal differences in the violence that they generate in comparison with the militaries. We have to continue to insist on this issue. Thank you, Estefanía. We are in awe to hear all of the information you're sharing, and thank you for giving that report. Isabel, Eduardo has a question. He has been working for a long time in the administration and procuration of justice and access to human rights, and what you pointed out, there hasn't been a lot of progress in this topic in the country, because there is no independence between the DA's offices. What could happen? That is the first question. Second question, you were talking about the shelter homes. Is it complex, all of the lackings that these shelter homes have? What is the option to help women who are in need of support? And aside from all of these lackings that you have shared with us, how does this impact budgetary cuts? So what are the real possibilities that women have in access to justice and to ask for support in Mexico? Thank you for those questions. So in terms of justice administration, one topic that we have promoted, which is important, is the importance of transparency. That goes hand in hand of what Estefanía was saying of militaries. It was not only about militaries. Both the administration of justice does not have clear data. We want for all sentences to be public. If we don't know, I don't know if you know the case of Los Porquis, which was very famous, where a judge decided that it wasn't rape because the boy didn't enjoy the act. So if we don't know these kinds of sentences, we cannot look to improve the administration of justice. So the first point would be to improve the transparency in the administration of justice. Also, the DA's offices have to improve. They have to improve their transparency. Right now, census, as they are, don't allow us to follow a case. What happens if we don't know if it gets to a sentence or not? So we also have to improve the records to improve the administration of justice. In terms of the independence of the DA's offices, it is a very complicated topic. Even though it was approved, we have to be careful on the independence of these DA's offices. Why do I say this? Right now, we are going through a very negative experience with the General DA's office in terms of transparency. EQUIS is part of the co-coordination of the nucleus of civil society, which is a group of civil society that follows up on government, specific government actions. And what commitment is the commitment to security? And the executive power is committed to that. So the General DA's office doesn't want to give us any information about security on terms of because of their independence. And since they said that is a topic from the DA's office, they don't want information. So it is a great concern in that regard. And also in Nuevo León, we have had this experience that because of the lack of coordination between the government and the DA's office, many things don't get ahead. So it is interesting to have this independence model. We also have to assess the states in which they are working and the pros and cons of all of these. In terms of the shelter homes, Fabio was talking more about the shelter homes. I was talking about the women's justice centers that have a little bit of time to stay. But what can we do with the lackings? We could allocate resources and have transparency on how these resources are allocated, and establishing accountability mechanisms as well. It is also necessary to provide information on where you can go to, which is the topic about that Fabiola was talking about the lack of information of women. And also in this context that Fabi is talking about, but that is very concerning, where we have a campaign, count to 10, and what they tell you is to wait, don't speak. First, bring out your white flag and then make a report. So there is a very complicated context. And I think that it would be going back into the feminist agenda. First, in the fight that we have taken for a victim to speak out. And if the president says that those calls are false, the only thing he's doing is telling women, we're not going to believe you. Your calls are false. So talking to the victims and telling them, yes, they're going to believe you, don't worry, that is taking us back. And also the private values. What we have fought for, right now we talk about the public space, but also private violence should be intervened by the government. And establishing that just with family values or fraternity are going to solve this problem is not correct. And that is leaving women alone, telling them you have to fix this by yourself. So all of this comes to strengthen the lackings, because what we are doing is for women to not go and report and to have less support. And also the budget cut is something very serious, where we are told that there's no budget for all of this process. And I am also concerned about the budget cuts to these indigenous women shelters. So I think that it's very important to continue to demand, even in this complicated context, because I think that being a Mexican woman right now is very complicated, but we have to continue asking for more budget, asking for the improvement of these public policies, for this not to be about looking at the black thread, but evaluating the existing policies and to improve them according to the impact assessments and impact evaluations that exist. So that would be a little bit of my response. Sorry that I extended so much. Thank you, Isabel. This campaign we just saw is terrible, and it's unthinkable. Unthinkable to have this campaign of count until 10. But Fabiola, we have 5 more minutes. It has been, all of the information has been very interesting. So I'm gonna summarize the questions to you. Aside from strengthening the local justice institutions, what other mechanisms could be effected to give assistance to violence against women from a local perspective? Another important question and simple is, who do women go to? The local police, the militaries, or who do they connect with to ask for help? And the other question is, thinking about women that have lived for so long in the US and due to adverse situation, they are deported or forcefully returned. What is the best way to inform women that doesn't know about the justice system in Honduras, in Mexico, but needs support? So the first question, I think we have to strengthen not only the local police or public ministry, but also consider the indigenous regulatory frameworks, because indigenous women are especially a vulnerable population, especially for gender-based violence. In studies that we have conducted on indigenous women and access to justice, they are the ones that ignore the most the services that could be provided to them, and the ones that have the most barriers to go to the authorities because of all the way they have to travel or the access to these authorities. So for the legislation not to include to have communities or peace judges to give assistance to these women leaves them neglected. And we not only have to see the state or community justice, but to see how we reinforce the support networks for the citizenship. What we have seen is that there is a cut in budget for civil organizations that were in charge of supporting women who are victims of violence. In terms of the contacts, I think that women go mainly to relatives or acquaintances because that's easy access for them. So a tool that could be used is to disseminate the faculties that other people have to request for support on behalf of the victims, because the victims don't know that they could do that. And most of the emergency calls in COVID times are made by relatives and not by the victims. So that's something that could be explored as well. Unfortunately, not only women, it should be generalized. Women don't know that there are protection services in place, but specifically for migrant women, information should be disseminated in different languages, or for women who speak an indigenous language, or for people who are disabled. There should be different mechanisms to make information accessible. And it should be simple language with not the legal jargon, so everyone can understand easily what these services are. And also for the information that is disseminated is very, very general, but it doesn't give specific information that they have to show. So I consider that if part of the information that is disseminated, they are explained that they don't have to show a passport or an ID or something like that, it would be easier for them to have access to justice, and for the enforcers not to put so many obstacles for them to access these services. Thank you, Fabiola, Isabel, Estefanía, and I'm gonna allow Lena to continue forward. We want to thank the audience for being here, and I want to especially thank the team of Alianza Americas and our interpreter who were in charge of we had a Zoom bombing in the English version, but our colleagues managed it professionally. So a big recognition to all of them, both in the Spanish and the English version, including all of the links to the work of EQUIS, to the articles recommended by Estefanía, and the investigation that she presented. All of these are going to be included in YouTube, so you can have access to that information. We know that many people enrolled to see it later on because they couldn't do it at this time. So we thank you for coming today, and we especially want to thank Estefanía Vela, Isabel Erreguerena, Fabiola Mondragón, sorry, and for sharing their knowledge with us. I hope this is the beginning of different dialogues that we're going to have, and that we can continue the work for violence against women. Thank you very much.